So our talk for today is meant to give us an overview of the place elementals occupy within the theosophical philosophy, and to even talk of their functions related to the phenomena they produce is actually way beyond the functions or beyond the scope of a single talk. If you want to hear more about the phenomena produced by elementals, you better read the articles in our theosophical literature, of which there are plenty. Both HPB and Mr. Judge have several articles on elementals. The subject is so big that it is necessary to limit ourselves to a general overview with some emphasis on the metaphysics behind the elementals. It is by understanding the root of the elementals that we also get to understand our own constitution better. So notwithstanding that we have many articles on the subject of elementals, like I said, virtually all of them deal with describing the phenomena that they produce. But relatively speaking, very little can be found on what they actually are, and most likely for good reasons. One of the reasons being is that whenever we have a feeling or a thought, we attract the corresponding forces that are magnetically connected with the content and energy of those thoughts and feelings. Mr. Crosby, in his answers to questions, you can find it on page 212, he explains it as follows. He says, there are many forms of elemental lives, all with their own natural powers, qualities, modes of action, and laws, but there is no explanation given further in regard to their nature, for the reason that once the key is given, the mere thinking about them attracts them to one. So what would be the use of thinking along these lines? It is just like taking matter into our bodies, which is not in any way assimilable. So unless we would be an adept or a psychic of a relatively high degree, I'm sure we can say that we have actually no clue what we are talking about. If we're honest as students, we don't really know what elementals are. Now, this lack of insight is not surprising when we realize that basically the whole of manifestation in its overwhelming complexity is made up of elemental substances or forces of innumerable degrees and functions. Think of the Hindu pantheon, for example, with its 330 million devas. This range covers the level from the highest gods or dhyanis all the way down to the lowest level of what we call elementals. And the majority of this number are actually elemental forces. So trying to give a definition of anything in theosophy always necessitates a combination of different aspects of what we're trying to define. Think of such terms as monads, lives, the logos, vag, pitris, karma, etc. A single definition always falls short and only covers one or a few aspects of a subject that we are dealing with and trying to understand. In one of our articles, HPB points out that there are nothing but beings in the universe, which makes sense if we accept the proposition that there is no such thing as dead matter. But often the expression being is substituted with other terms such as entities, monads, atoms, elementals, lives, jivas, etc. So this often results for the student, or can often result in a confused understanding where the philosophy can mask itself in nothing but a garb of vocabulary. So how to go beyond the semantics unless it is through understanding and conceptualization. So whereas on the one hand, intelligence is the capacity to understand, on the other hand, intellect, what we refer to as intellectual stuff, is more the capacity to describe, we could say. So in the best of circumstances, the two need to go hand in hand, and whether the following explanations live up to that standard, that is for each of you to decide. Now, for starters, think of it this way. When a universe comes into being, three conditions need to be met with. And Mr. Sobereau, in his article, Brahmanism on the Sevenfold Principle in Man, published in 5 Years of Theosophy, it starts on page 153. He refers to these conditions as primaries. So these three primaries are consciousness, energy, and substance, for which Sobereau obviously uses the Sanskrit terminology, Parabrahm, Shakti, and Prakriti. But these three correspond with consciousness, energy, and matter. So this is our basic setup for the manifestation of a galaxy, a solar system, or a planetary chain, including all the kingdoms of nature. So what we are primarily concerned with for our subject of today is not so much consciousness per se, which is the capacity to perceive, or the monad per se, the one and only, the tetractys of Pythagoras, that represents infinite potential, nor are we so much concerned with the object of perception, what we call matter. Our emphasis will be more focused on the substance of the perception itself that falls in between these two extremes of what you can simply call spirit and matter. So spirit is the power to perceive, matter is the capacity to be perceived, either of which, as HPB says in the first fundamental, are not independent realities, but only constitute the basis of conditioned being, she says, whether subjective or objective. So between these two, we have the substance of perception itself, you could say our field of awareness and its related activities, of course, whether mental, psychological, or philosophical, that wavers between these two polarities, and which we can also define as consciousness in operation or force. And it is this field that actually represents the living manifested universe that is made up of and forms the realm of the elementals. But before we get there, it is necessary to elaborate a little bit on the semantics for this subject. A lot of confusion can arise when certain distinctions are not being made. For instance, the distinction between the monad and the monads, the distinction between powers and forces, and also the distinction between substance and matter, especially the last two being frequently interchanged in our daily conversations. So remember also that with perhaps a few exceptions, there is no explicit theosophical nomenclature per se in our philosophy. All the terminologies that we use in our theosophy are derived from other sources, as we find explained in the introductory to the Secret Doctrine. The reason for it being that anything of a truly esoteric nature never, ever leaves the premises of the White Lodge of the Mahatmas. Besides the fact that the students, even if they were given, we wouldn't be able to understand them at our present level of mental development, in association, of course, with the coarseness of our present brain. So a short definition of the monad we have already touched upon as that infinite potential or capacity that exists in every point of the universe, and which is also the very essence of our being and of all beings, whether manifested or unmanifested. So this capacity is also referred to as Atma or Purusha, depending on the context and the religion or philosophy from which these terms are derived. And HPB often uses exoteric terms, but gives them a theosophical slant. So you really have to pay attention whenever she uses Oriental terminologies. Now, the monads, however, plural, represent that point in manifestation where that infinite potential connects or associates itself with substance, giving rise to the duad, the twofold. So it is strictly speaking not a monad per se anymore, but twofold, spirit and substance, or Purusha and Prakriti, or Atma and Buddhi, and constitutes the first condition of universal homogeneity that prepares the way to individualization in order to manifest then the potentiality of manas that is already pre-existing in the monad per se. The manifested manas is actually Atma itself manifesting through Buddhi. So that is one distinction we can make with regard to the monad. Another one, and important with regard to our subject of the elementals, is to understand the distinction between powers and forces. Be aware, however, that HPB, just like ourselves, is not always consistent in the use of terminology and sometimes uses the one for the other. So again, looking at the context in which a particular term is used is of the utmost importance. Now, powers are most often associated with either individuals or hierarchies of beings, like the Anibuddhas, Manasaputras, Pitris, or the Dhyanis in general, whereas their activities or their expressions are usually associated with forces or elementals. So in other words, powers and forces relate to one another as noumena stand to phenomena, or as causes stand to effects. So the same is true for our last comparison, substance versus matter. And some of you may recall that at the Convention of Copenhagen in Denmark in 1978, that's 43 years ago, quantum physicists officially declared that matter doesn't exist, but that what we perceive as matter is actually energy or forces concentrated or densified to such an extent that they become visible or objective within the spectrum of our sensory instruments and give us that limited impression of what we call matter, and unfortunately perceive as the reality that surrounds us. So nowadays, this level is referred to as Newtonian physics, in contradistinction to quantum physics, that deals with a whole different level of content, you could say. So in other words, matter is nothing but a perception imposed on us through the use of limited senses of something that is there, but the reality of which evades our physical perception. So it is not as if nothing is there. That's not what neither quantum physicists nor theosophists are saying. What scientists were saying in 1978 was, however, already stated 90 years earlier by HPB in volume 1 of The Secret Doctrine. And you find that on page 329, sorry. It's probably one of the most exquisite statements to be found in The Secret Doctrine. And what she says there is as follows. In strict accuracy, to avoid confusion and misconception, watch out when she says that, you know, you're confused. So in strict accuracy, the term matter ought to be applied to the aggregate of objects of possible perception and substance to noumena. For inasmuch as the phenomena of our plane are the creation of the perceiving ego, the modifications of its own subjectivity, all the states of matter representing the aggregate of perceived objects can have but a relative and purely phenomenal existence for the children of our plane. Now that's quite a mouthful. Possible perception or the phenomena of our plane are the creation of the perceiving ego, the modifications of its own subjectivity. What does that mean? Well, it simply means that whatever the ego perceives is related to the level of instruments and our sensory perceptions, our likes and dislikes, our thoughts and feelings and emotions that we have Those are the modifications of our own subjectivity as perceivers. And so she says all these states of matter representing the aggregate of perceived objects can have but a relative and purely phenomenal existence for our plane. Mr. Crosby puts it slightly different in answers to questions. You find that on page 27. And he says, what we call matter is the embodiment of many kinds of lives. We use it continually in our bodies through the food we take. So he takes it all the way to the physical level. We impress those lives with our feelings during the time these lives form parts of our body. When they return to their own kingdoms, so when is that? Well, when we die, or also the continuous shedding and turnover of our substance within our body, they carry the impulse we have given them, whether good or bad. So when they again are drawn into other forms, like in the lower kingdoms, they still carry our impressions. So no small part of our physical karma lies in this direction. So the lives he's speaking of are obviously the elemental substances or forces. So now, in this field of awareness or perception, on deeper levels than our waking consciousness, and which lies hidden within the recesses of our own inner constitution and virtually excluded from our objective perceptions, is it that we find the realm of the elementals, and to which we can attribute such terms as force and substance. So whereas on the one hand, force represents the subjective part of the elementals, on the other hand, substance represents the objective part of the elementals, what makes them become visible to a clairvoyant, and even under certain atmospheric conditions, they can be perceived. So from a cosmic perspective, this whole realm of elementals we find represented in the first volume of the Secret Doctrine in the diagram on page 200, referred to as the four Rupa planes, being the quaternary of the universe as a whole. And this realm can therefore be designated as psychic relative to the Arupa, being divine or noetic. So keep in mind, however, that since everything is in coordination, we'll explain that term later, every plane is also represented as subdivisions within every other plane. So everything exists within everything. We'll show you the diagram. Let's see. Let me adjust my...
Is the screen sharing?
Yep. Okay, thank you. I need to adjust my... Okay, all right. Thank you, Jonathan. So what we see here are 7 planes. It says at the top, first plane. So 1, 2, 3, that's where you see the triangle. The apex of the triangle barely touches the first plane. So we have 3 Arupa planes. Rupa means form, so Arupa, the negative, no form. So that's where you see the first plane and the triangle. And then that is followed by 3 Rupa planes, the planes of form. That's where you see the globes. And we're only going to be concerned with the left-hand side. The right-hand side refers to the Chaldean Kabbalah. It's almost the same with slight distinctions, and which can be important, but we're only dealing with the left-hand side where we see our globes from A to G. So if we call the 3 Arupa planes divine or noetic, from that perspective, we can call the 4 Rupa planes then psychic, or rather the first 3 Rupa planes and the bottom one we can call material, if you like. Now, we see all of this in a linear way, of course. It has certain advantages in the sense that you can point out the different parts of the diagram. It also has the advantage that you see a hierarchical structure. Now, HPB says all of these 7 planes are in reality in coordination, which means they all interpenetrate each other within the same space. There's only one plane in the infinite universe, but you could say it has, we can refer to it as innumerable, almost infinite subdivisions. But we know that if we have 2 objects of the same substance, they can't occupy the same space. But if they are of different substances, so HPB says all these levels are not consubstantial. That means that they can all interpenetrate each other, and that is what is referred to as being in coordination. Now, this diagram is actually quite amazing because you can look at it from a cosmic perspective. And if we do that, then we can say that all our experiences, even up to what we call our higher manas, buddhi, and manas, and Atma, are all relegated to the lowest globe that we see there on the left-hand side, the Earth, globe D. All our experiences are limited to that plane. We have no direct contact with the planes above. Another way of looking at the diagram is, since the whole diagram also returns on every plane, so you can look at the whole diagram, and which is what we're going to do for what follows. Look at the whole diagram just as globe D, and we see the same subdivisions there. 3 arupa planes with 4 rupa planes. So when I said psychic in this sense, relative to the noetic, leaving aside its undeserved pejorative designation usually, psychic can then be considered as consciousness, since we're talking rupa or form, as consciousness tainted with or manifested through a vehicle or instrument of substance, which we can also call soul in different degrees of density and quality. And the soul is thus a vehicle of and for experience. So we have to make a distinction here between the term psychic and the term psychism, obviously. Psychism is a kind of super sensitivity and influence of and for the lower forces or the lower cities in physical nature. So to sum up a little bit the foregoing in simpler terms and coming back to our 3 primaries of consciousness, energy, and matter, or monads, elementals, and atoms, we can define them, among other definitions, of course, as follows. A monad is a center of spiritual force or energy. An elemental is a center of psychic force, and an atom, in the scientific sense, as a center of physical force. So to all of these centers, we can then refer to as a center or a heart that is everywhere and the circumference of which is nowhere. So from this perspective, we can say that everything that exists on these 4 rupa planes or form planes, whether we call them spiritual, psychic, astral, or material, is in effect made up of innumerable degrees of elemental substances, starting with the first differentiated hierarchies, themselves also consisting of elementals, all the way down to the coarsest material substance that we can imagine. So speaking now of degrees of elementals, we see that as these powers or hierarchies emanate down through the 4 rupa planes, deeper and deeper into matter, the substance on each plane downward increases in density. Its characteristics change and its forces diminish in spiritual quality. And therefore, as HPB says, different names are given to these same hierarchies as they descend through the planes, as also different qualities are assigned to the elementals in their densification down to globe D. So it's interesting to take a closer look at the original definition, actually, of the word substance to understand what we mean by that. And the word substance if you divide it into sub and stans, then think of a submarine below, sub and stans, which comes from the Latin root substantia, which means being or essence, from the verb substare, which means standing below or supporting. Now, supporting what? Well, obviously consciousness that, hierarchically speaking, precedes substance. And consciousness cannot manifest on any plane unless it has a vehicle or a support to work through. Now, HPB refers to this support in volume 2 of The Secret Doctrine on page 42. She says, for instance, in Kapila Sankhya philosophy, unless allegorically speaking, Purusha mounts on the shoulders of Prakriti. The latter, Prakriti, remains irrational, while the former, Purusha, remains inactive without her. Therefore, nature in man must become a compound of spirit and matter, she says, before he becomes what he is. And the spirit latent in matter must be awakened to life and consciousness gradually. So that compound of spirit and matter can obviously be referred to as our living and moving universe that basically consists of our elemental forces and substances, and which is also the monad or consciousness in operation. So in both Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, we hear HPB speaking of the elements: earth, water, air, and fire. So these are not the elements as we know them on our plane, mentioned in the periodic table of the chemical elements, of which about 70 were known in HPB's time. Today we know 94 of them which exist in nature, and then the rest up to, 118 or 120 or something. The rest has to be synthesized in the laboratory, and they usually have a very short lifespan as well, sometimes a fraction of a second even. So these first three elements, fire, air, and water, are actually those spiritual essences or powers, those Dhyan Chohans, for which the elementals function as the forces and vehicles throughout our universe. So all these different spiritual elements, says HPB, and you'll find that on page 339 in volume 1, are the veiled synthesis standing for Dhyan Chohans, Devas, Sephiroths, Amshaspens, archangels, etc., etc. And the astral substance, our elementals, or ether of signs, she says, constitute, so to speak, the rude material out of which the above named builders, the Dhyan Chohans, following the plan traced out for them eternally in the divine thought, fashion the systems in the cosmos, the systems being galaxies, solar systems, planetary systems, and etc. And on page 176, HPB refers also to 7 kingdoms. And she tells us that there are 3 kingdoms that precede our mineral, vegetable, animal, and human kingdom. So here we hit upon the different degrees of these elemental substances. And she says, now I quote, there are 7 kingdoms, and she divides them in 3 groups. The first group comprises 3 degrees of elementals, or nascent centers of forces. From the first stage of differentiation from Mula Prakriti, primordial homogeneous matter, to its 3rd degree, that is from full unconsciousness to semi-perception. The second or higher group embraces the kingdoms from vegetable to man, and the mineral kingdom, thus forming the central or turning point in the degrees of the monadic essence, considered as an evoluting energy. Now, these 3 stages, sub-physical, on the elemental side, the mineral kingdom, 3 stages on the objective physical side, these are the first or preliminary 7 links, she says, of the evolutionary chain. preliminary because they are preparatory. And though belonging in fact to the natural, they yet would be more correctly described as subnatural evolutions, she says. So we are actually still in our evolution, part of the subnatural evolution. And then she says this process makes a halt in its stages at the third, at the threshold of the fourth stage. So at the third, at the threshold of the fourth stage is the end of what you could call our human kingdom. When it becomes, she says, on the plane of the natural evolution, the first really manward stage, thus forming, and here's a very odd thing, thus forming with the three elemental kingdoms, the 10, the Sephirothal number. Now, she just referred to 7 kingdoms, 3 elemental ones, and then mineral, vegetable, animal, and human. And then she refers to that fourth stage, and all of a sudden, we have not 7 anymore, but we have 10. Now, one way of looking at it is in the following way. If you look again at the diagram, and you think only of globe D. Now, what we can say then is that the first elemental, the first Rupa plane, sometimes also referred to by HVB as the spiritual plane in manifestation, even though we just said that the 4 planes are psychic, but that's relative, of course, to the Arupa planes. But if you divide then that psychic again in subdivisions, then the first Rupa plane we can refer to as spiritual, corresponding with the element fire, and also the first elemental kingdom. The second Rupa plane corresponding with psychic, the element air, and the second elemental kingdom. The third Rupa plane, astral, the element water, the third elemental kingdom, and the fourth Rupa plane, globe D at the bottom, the corresponding with physical, obviously, and the element earth. And HVB says these 3, the mineral kingdom at the bottom, as the condensation or precipitation comes from the third elemental kingdom. So the third elemental kingdom precipitates or condensates as what we call the mineral kingdom on our plane. So coming back to what she said there with regard to those different stages, if we now start on the first plane as the elemental kingdom, we descend down to the second plane, second elemental kingdom, down to the third plane, third elemental kingdom. Then on the physical plane, it turns into mineral with its evolutions of vegetable, animal, and human. And then we return back up after that to the third, to the fourth, the third, the second, and the first elemental kingdom. And that is what makes up our 10 steps to go from the first elemental kingdom through what she calls then the subnatural evolution, all the way to the human kingdom, and 3 more stages of what you could call angelic or divine. So that makes up our 10 steps of the Sephirothal number. So that's one way of looking at these 4 Rupa planes, corresponding them with the elemental kingdoms and with the elements. But keep in mind that every one of these planes, of the Rupa planes, has all of that again as subdivisions. And each subdivision has all of that again as subdivisions. And you can go on ad infinitum because HVB says substance is infinitely divisible. As long as you have something and you have the means to divide it, then you have 2 somethings, and then you start again with 1 part, and you can go on and on and on ad infinitum. So these few examples of correspondences can obviously be further extended. Now, keep in mind that these kingdoms, from a cosmical perspective, like I said, are repeated as subdivisions on every plane except the element earth. But when we speak of elementals in our terrestrial realm, globe D, the element earth is added. And on our plane, the Kabbalists refer to these elementals as gnomes for earth, undines for water, sylphs for air, and salamanders for fire. And if you look into the glossary under the term elementals, you'll find another 20 or so different names for these terrestrial elementals. Now, the astral substance, or the ether of science, to which HVB refers to in the Secret Doctrine, are today the forces with which the scientists are playing in, for instance, the particle accelerator at CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research in Switzerland. And that astral substance is made up of these innumerable elementals, each of which represent the psychic or astral components of the reflections of each of these spiritual elements that make up the first Rupa planes of our globe D, and of which this third elemental kingdom, corresponding to water, like we said, crystallizes onto the physical plane as the mineral kingdom, and that we get to know as our chemical elements that we find in the periodical table. So what the scientists at CERN are dealing with is definitely, if you look only at the whole diagram as a globe D, is definitely the next plane up, where you see globe C and E. Are they going further? That's very hard for us to say, but they're definitely on a different plane that we refer to as quantum physics. So from all of this follows that the mental and psychic constituents of our being also consist of these elemental divisions that make up the energy or the forces that we use in our own constitution. So on our plane, what we consider to be solids, liquids, gases, and fire now in physics referred to as plasma, are in reality made up of all these elemental forces or substances that, when they come within the range of our sensory instruments, we perceive as the external objective realities that we call matter. So one may now ask the question, how do these elements and elementals relate to, for instance, the gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas? Well, according to Sankhya philosophy and also in theosophy, the gunas represent the three characteristics of this force and substance. Sattva represent the characteristic of maintaining a dynamic equilibrium. Rajas represents the characteristic of motion or change, and tamas, that of inertia. So all existing matter, including the elementals or forces, can thus only be in any one of these four states, be they solids, liquids, gases, or fire or plasma. So sattva is, of course, don't look upon sattva when we say equilibrium as being static. Sattva represents a dynamic equilibrium. And we have to think of a person who's walking on a tightrope, for instance, who is in a dynamic equilibrium. Similarly, inertia doesn't mean rest as such, but is the tendency to remain unchanged in its state or maintain its condition or velocity until an external force either slows it down or accelerates it. So this is actually how the gunas relate then to substance. Now, since consciousness per se in theosophy is defined as the power to move or change, it follows that all substances, being in perpetual motion, represent at the same time a state of consciousness on its own plane. Now, you may have the question whether elementals can be self-conscious. And HPB points out that there are indeed beings within the elemental realms that have a kind of highly developed human consciousness, to which he refers as semi-conscious elementals. But the details there are rather scarce. There seems to be a connection with at least one aspect of what she calls the Sapta Rishis. But it's, like I said, the details are scarce. So that doesn't take away that even a human being can be in an elemental state of consciousness. HPB sometimes refers to humans as elementals, meaning that to the extent that we do not exercise our self-devised and self-induced efforts and fall back upon our instincts and our likes and dislikes, we actually become an elemental. Think, for instance, of coming under the influence of a hypnotist, or the influence of advertising and marketing tricks. When we do not think for ourselves anymore, we actually become human elementals. So all of the foregoing goes to prove that we are inside and outside, surrounded and made up of living entities or elemental substances and forces of all kinds. And one of the typical qualities of elementals is that they reflect what we put into them. They can act as a kind of memory bank. We magnetize them like a memory stick or a solid state drive or a hard disk. So in other words, we color them with our own personality traits or characteristics that drive our activities. And whenever we draw upon that memory through thoughts and feelings, they release it back upon its source, which is ourselves. So this very much connects the elementals with being the agents of karma. In fact, elementals, you could say, elementals and karma are twins. Now, as to the phenomena they produce, since they represent the forces in nature, not the powers, remember, of which they are the agents, we can think of any phenomenon that is not connected with one or the other division of elementals. Mr. Judge calls the elementals the nerves of nature, which is another interesting definition, as our nerves represent the channels through which motion is distributed throughout our body, and are also the channels and agents that connect the astral with the physical. Our nerves is the connection between our physical body and the astral body. And we know that because HPB says that the senses actually operate on the level of the astral body, not of the physical body. Your eye doesn't see anything, your ear don't hear anything. It is the data from outside that comes inside our physical instruments and are then directed into the astral brain, where it is picked up by the astral brain, and that's where it becomes sound or seeing or touch and so forth and so forth. So the elementals distribute and at the same time represent the forces throughout nature. Now, just to sum up a few of these extraordinary psychic phenomena, just to satisfy your curiosity, think of levitation, for instance. The production of sounds and colors, the use of mantras, moving objects without touch or locking them into place, a capacity that HPB had, moving objects through each other, permeability, bending objects, think of the matrix here, the spoon that bends, telepathy, the animation of astral shells in seances, the production of certain thought forms, say like the appearance of the Virgin Mary in Lourdes in France. Think of the effects of drugs, voodoo dolls, having green fingers for plants, etc., etc. You name it, all of these find their origin within one or another realm of these elementals. So all of these phenomena are set in motion by the powerful will of someone who is adept in the use of sound, color, numbers, rhythm, geometry, and substances. And HPB, in her recapitulation of the 10 fundamental items in volume 2 of ISIS, it starts on page 587, but in the last item, she ends there by saying that the cornerstone of magic is an intimate practical knowledge of magnetism and electricity, their quantities, correlations, and potencies, which constitute those elementals, of course, by which nature becomes the material ally, pupil, and servant of the magician. And if anyone wants to dive into all these phenomena, read Isis Unveiled. It's full with it. So friends, I hope that all of this wasn't too overwhelming. And I also hope this approach has contributed a little bit to your understanding. Do we still have time for questions or so?
We certainly do. We've got at least 15 minutes.
All right.
Can I do stop share, or do you want the diagram up?
You can keep it up in case somebody wants to refer to it.
Judy Salzman has raised her hand.
Go ahead, Judy.
Be sure and unmute.
Yeah, you have to unmute.
Unmute.
Yep, there you are.
Okay. Well, if no one else wants to ask the question, I'd like to.
Yeah, go ahead. You raised your hand first.
You can see me, but you can hear me. Yes, I think initially Pierre said that the universe has three characteristics. You have to have Param, Shakti, and Prakriti. And am I correct in quoting the Sanskrit in that way?
Yeah, or consciousness, energy, and matter. If you remove one of them, you can't build.
And matter.
Yeah.
So really, although we can divide it these three ways, we have ultimately one universe, but in the it seems to be that the elemental realm would have to do with the emergence of Prakriti, that without it we could not have life, which is everywhere, and that these elementals that form all of life are the result of the energy in Prakriti. Is that the case? And as human beings, we really are divine monads, but if we let ourselves be dragged down to the level of elementals, then we have become kind of like Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, kind of animal-like.
Yeah, HPB, when we look at this diagram, she says there are 7 planes of Prakriti, but I've noticed that a lot of students sometimes skip that, what she's saying about it, that is that they are relatively homogeneous, because each plane has its own homogeneity, you could say, which is then again the highest subdivision of the 7-fold division of each plane. And so say, for instance, that you would be on the first Rupa plane. If you would be looking down on the homogeneous substance of the next plane down, you would see that as already differentiated. To you, it would be differentiated. So, but to us, being on that plane, say we're on the plane of B or F there, globe B or F, to us, the substance on our own plane has a limit where it becomes homogeneous. But for a being on a higher plane, our homogeneous substance would already be differentiated. And it's an interesting question to think about, what is actually Prakriti? It's not that when the demiurge manifests and opens his eyes, so I'm anthropomorphizing it a little bit, that there is this kind of spiritual clay hanging in space. That's not the case. Think actually of Prakriti as the assimilated substance of previous manvantaras. And that is applicable to every plane, of course. So when Purusha mounts on the shoulders of Prakriti, it is actually coming back into contact with its previously assimilated memory, you could say, of previous manvantaras. And then when that differentiates, it gives rise again to the evolution on that specific plane. So you could also say there is elementals on the Arupa planes too. It sounds a bit odd, but you may recall that HPB in the transactions It's on page 111, I think, where she says, keep in mind that these planes are arupa to our perception, but to the beings on that plane is just as much substance as substance is to us here. So arupa and rupa are again relative, but with regard to arupa planes, we have absolutely no idea how to conceptualize that. And that's why relatively little is said, because you could say that the first three spiritual elements, like fire, air, and water, also make up the three arupa planes. Then they reflect themselves onto the rupa planes, and then they reflect themselves again on globe D. So, but yeah, there's very little that we can say, because the arupa planes obviously also have spiritual beings. Think of the ahi that wake up first at the apex of the triangle. And then out of that, the second logos evolves, which are the Dhyaniputas, which are at the same time Manasaputras, like HPB says. And then that gives rise to the third logos, again beings, and that's still all unmanifested. It's not until we reach the first rupa plane that we can actually speak of prakriti. Arupa would be better to call it mula prakriti, the root of prakriti. All right.
Yeah, will you take a question from Monica? She's
Sure. Go ahead, Monica.
Thank you. Such a great presentation. Thank you very much. You mentioned that the elementals are agents for karma. And so my question is twofold. One, do they make up the skandhas? And what determines what karma is to be worked out in any given incarnation?
Okay, so what is the relationship of elementals to skandhas? Well, Shrivisa's skandhas are bundles of tendencies. And these bundles of tendencies consist of bundles of elementals. And what is the content of that? Well, those are the psychic remnants, you could say, because when we pass away, our physical body is left behind. And then you could say the psychic being or constituents of our being start falling apart in Kamaloka. And eventually there's a kind of, just like with on the physical plane, what the residue is ultimately ashes of the physical body. On the physical, on the Kamarupa plane, the same thing happens, but we call those ashes then skandhas. And those skandhas, when we reincarnate, those skandhas and elementals are imprinted with our thoughts and our feelings, with which we have magnetized them, good or bad. Also the good skandhas, not all the good skandhas necessarily go into Devachan. So all the skandhas, whether good or bad, are then when we reincarnate, they are magnetically attracted to the incarnating ego. And that is what is going to make up our future or the karma of that new life. But of course, keep in mind, not necessarily everything from a previous life immediately manifests, or from many lives ago. HPB says that, that humanity is still being bothered by elemental substances that go back to Atlantean times. So yeah, it's it's an incredibly complex subject, but those skandhas are our tendencies, and then it depends in the new life of whether we act upon them or not, or uproot them, so to speak. And ultimately, the ultimate purpose is to uproot all of them. They keep coming back until we take care of all of them.
Thank you.
Patience sweet that not can ruffle.
Mhm.
We have another hand from the lady in blue.
So that's probably me.
Hi, Sue.
Great to hear your talk. You are very knowledgeable, and just packed with information. I'm from Seattle, by the way. Hello to everyone. So I had a question about the Prakriti being assimilated substance of previous Manvantaras. Does that extend out to other chains or even to other solar systems? Over.
Absolutely. Yeah. Our present planetary chain is the reincarnation of the previous planetary chain, which is usually referred to as the moon chain. So HPB gives an explanation. I think it starts on, what is it, 171 or so, where she refers to some misconceptions about the moon and so forth. And there she says, when a planetary chain dies off, it sends its energies and qualities to a new set of 7 Laya points for each globe, a new set of Laya points to which those energies are attracted. Well, what are those energies? Well, they're the skandhas of the moon. So there you see that there is an exact correspondence between the dying off of a planetary chain and the dying off of an individual. And if you think about it, if you understand a little bit of how HPB explains the mechanics behind it, she says that, so there is monads circling around those globes, and going from A to G is what is referred to as a round. Now she says in the last round, when the life wave of monads goes from A to B, in the last round, globe A starts dying off. And then the monads move from B to C, then globe B starts dying off. Then from C to E, and from C to D, and globe C starts dying off. Now, if you look in the Seeker Doctrine on page 153, you will find another diagram there where these 7 globes are corresponded with our principles. Now, here's an interesting question to think through. What is that? What actually happens when we die? We think of our physical body as, well, that's the first one to go, but follows what she explains here. We already start dying before we're dead. Is something wonderful to look forward to. Mr. Judge says that that can take up to 2 years before the physical body dies. So when it's time to die, obviously the spiritual element in us knows what is going to happen. And so you will see that on page 153, globe A corresponds with Buddhi. So it is the spiritual soul that, what word can you use, feels that the time has arrived karmically to start withdrawing. So then it is actually the physical soul that starts withdrawing first. So we see a perfect correspondence between planetary chains dying off or human beings dying off. I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, that's great. Then what about solar systems?
Same for solar systems or for galaxies.
Is that right? Yeah, I figured. Yeah.
He speaks of a planetary spirit, which you could say is the top dog, as people sometimes refer, or the CEO of a planetary chain. And that is the sum total of all the hierarchies, the conscious hierarchies that work through a planetary chain. Now, the same is true for a solar system in its totality. There is also a CEO, how would you call that? Instead of a planetary, you call it a solar spirit. The same must be true for larger systems. We don't know what the next step is between a solar system and a galaxy. Is that immediately a jump, or are there maybe systems in between? That's possible. Maybe what we refer to as the zodiac, the zodiacal system, could also be a system in itself of which our sun is a part. But at some point you arrive at the galaxy, and our galaxy is actually relatively small. It's only about 100,000 light years in diameter, so nothing to write home about. And there is a consciousness that is the highest level of what is possible there. And you can go on and on and on. HPB says, if you look at page 200, she says, above and below, the planes go on ad infinitum. So yeah, it's really until the mind reels and is exhausted, she says. It's just amazing.
Totally. So Blavatsky, if I can ask one more, if that's okay with everybody. So there's another question, I'll go quickly. So she speaks about the central spiritual sun or the central sun as being a predominant force or logos or some sort of a guidance for the solar systems. She doesn't talk about it much. But so then there's even more higher than that, would you say? Over?
Yeah, absolutely. That you can look at that central spiritual sun in different ways. You can think of our sun that you see in the sky there as being the visible sun, obviously. Now, HPB says, well, that's just a mirror for a spiritual sun. But look at the distinction she makes. Sometimes she refers to a spiritual sun. Sometimes she refers to a central spiritual sun. So in reality, we actually have three stages. Again, perhaps corresponding with spirit, soul, and body, or consciousness, energy, and matter. The material part of it is what we see. So within the sun itself are different degrees that you can refer to as a central spiritual sun, a central sun, and the visible sun. But our sun itself, she explains that in the Secret Doctrine with regard to the, I think the Assyrian astronomical system, where she says that according to them, our solar system orbits another star. And there's even now scientists who suspect that our sun could be a double star with another star, but our sun orbits another sun. That sun orbits another sun, and that sun orbits a center that is somewhere in the Pleiades, maybe Aldebaran. So you see just the range is absolutely mind-boggling, how far it goes. And then we're still talking about our galaxy, of which there are a gazillion, because scientists speak of how do they call that? When galaxies collide, form together?
Clusters.
Clusters, that's it. They speak of clusters, and then there's many clusters, then you have superclusters, and then you probably have clusters of superclusters ad infinitum. It's absolutely mind-boggling. And here we are on this little tiny globe. But you know, it doesn't really matter where you are in the universe, because if you would be somewhere else, you would ask the same question. Yeah, why am I here and not there? Well, you got to be somewhere in the universe. Okay.
Can you take a question from David?
Okay, go ahead, David.
Oh, thanks. One area we didn't quite touch on yet, way down the abstraction ladder here is the relation between the elementals, or how they coalesce to what HPB refers to as elementaries, and what are they? And could you talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Elementaries are, and keep in mind that no matter what you talk about in theosophy, there is degrees in everything. There's degrees in adepts, there's degrees in Mahatmas, there's most likely degrees in Nirmanakayas, so there's also degrees in elementaries. And the elementaries are actually the astral shells in which it is possible that self-consciousness can still be operative. But again, that depends on the degree. But it's usually a reference to astral shells or Kamarupas in Kamaloka, yeah? And they are, of course, attracted to seances, and they can also influence people that have an affinity for the kind of substance that makes up those elementaries. So, and that's how we can attract thoughts and feelings of other people, and they can be on the other end of the world. the space and time on the level of the astral plane is different. There's still space and time, but it's different than our space and time. Sometimes when you study, HPV points that out, Mr. Judge too, as well. You study something and you don't really get it, and all of a sudden a thought drops in your head. It may very well be possible that somebody was about around the same time studying the same thing and figured it out. And if there is an element of sympathy there, we can pick that up. But we can also attract those elementaries.
Could I ask you kind of a final question here, if I could? This might possibly bring things down to kind of the practical theosophy, I guess. You mentioned the idea that there's these three descending layers of the elementals.
Yeah.
And the fire, the air, the water, and the mineral kingdom, I guess.
Elements. Yeah.
Then you have the four kingdoms that we normally think of: mineral, plant, animal, human. But then to make the Sephiroth 10, you referred to elementals on the way back up, you could say. And I was wondering if it has anything to do with the following sentence from Judge here, other than the fact that everything has to do with everything, right? But okay, this is from Meditation, Concentration, and Will from Judge, and the very last paragraph, people will recognize this. He says, if we do all of our acts, I think this has to do with consecration of kind of a direction in our lives. If we do all of our acts, small and great, every moment for the sake of the whole human race, as representing the Supreme Self, then every cell and fiber of the body and inner man will be turned in one direction, resulting in perfect concentration. Would you say that that has anything to do with that road upwards?
Well, yeah, definitely. Like I said, you can look at this diagram from a cosmic perspective, and we're on globe D. You can also say it's globe D. You can also say 7 planes, each plane represents a principle. You can also look at the whole diagram as mind. Arupa, higher mind, Rupa, lower mind, the 7 globes corresponding to our senses. So now we see that the senses then occupy certain levels of elemental substances or elements, and what also connects them obviously with the elements as the Dianchoans, for instance. So yeah, there's definitely a relationship with it. When we come into being, like when we are born, where do we start from? Well, we start from the first elemental kingdom, and then we descend deeper and deeper into matter until eventually we arrive in the womb as a sperm that has fructified an egg. And that combination then makes up our physical constituents. But all the others are still there. All these planes are, like we said, they are all in coordination. It's confusing sometimes if you look at the linear perspective. You want to say that's there and that's here. Everything is right here in front of our nose at the same time. Everything exists within everything. And so, yeah, states of consciousness is exactly the same. Or think of, you know, that table that HVB refers to on, what is it, 157,
I think, right? Or,
157, yeah, with the Taraka Raja Yoga.
Yep.
It is possible, perhaps, that these 4 Rupa planes, fire, air, water, and earth, correspond with the 4 Upadis.
Mhm.
Of course, there's always, when you make correspondences, there is always going to be slight aberrations, of course, because don't forget that consciousness doesn't necessarily mean, correspondence does not necessarily mean identity, but there's a relationship between them. Yeah. So you can make up all kinds of things about this diagram. It's just absolutely fantastic diagram. Yeah. good to meditate on.
Yeah.
Our
Wow.
levels of waking consciousness, you can also say glow deep. Dream state, next plane up. Deep sleep, next plane up. Turiya, A and G. There you go.
Well, I think our time is past a little bit, but thank you very, very much for doing this, Pierre. I hope you'll do more of these. And I think I speak for a lot of us when I say that, but I know you're a busy guy. So thank you all very, very much for coming. I'm sure that you all learned a lot, as I did, and at least have decided to hit the books.
But there's one thing I can say. You could say, okay, but you've been talking a lot of metaphysics. How does that relate to ethics? Don't forget, HPB mentions that somewhere, that ethics is applied metaphysics. So keep that in mind. There is a reason why we study the metaphysics, to better ourselves. It's just not a mental exercise. All right.
A thumbs up from Sue, and she's clapping now. So
Thank you, guys.
thank you all
very much.
for coming.
Bye, everybody.
Next week, the presentation will be on sound. So that'll be another one of those one-word presentations. So, which can go very, very deep. The shorter the presentation title, the deeper the subject. So, thank you all.
Hey, guys.
Thank you. Good
Thank you
night.
so much. Wonderful. Everybody be well and safe.
All right, Monica, take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You're great.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.